Hospital workers, what regrets do you hear from dying patients? As a nursing student, I remember Frank vividly. He was one of my very first patients, and he was 92 years old. During my first few days of caring for him, he shared with me his biggest regret, outliving all the people he loved. Frank and his wife never had children, so when she passed away, he was left feeling alone and longing to see her again. I didn't know how to respond to Frank's heart-wrenching confession, so I simply listened. It made me realize that living a long life isn't necessarily a blessing if everyone you love is gone. Sadly, Frank passed away later that same week. Although some of my classmates were upset, I felt a sense of relief for him because I knew he was finally where he wanted to be. In the years since Frank, I've cared for many other patients, but I'll never forget my first one. And when it comes to regrets from dying patients, it's often the same story. They wish they had spent more time with their family and loved ones instead of focusing so much on work and other trivial matters. It's a common theme that reminds me to treasure the people in my life and make the most of every moment. Losing a partner is always a possibility, no matter how long you've been together. It's something you should prepare for emotionally, mentally, and even financially. I learned this lesson firsthand from my boyfriend who was a workaholic and died at just 30 years old. Hearing stories from patients like Frank, who regret outliving their loved ones, has also made me realize the importance of cherishing the time you have with those you love. More than anything, I wish people would prioritize spending time with family and loved ones instead of getting caught up in work and other trivial things. As a hospice social worker, I have the privilege of listening to people's life stories, including their favorite memories and regrets. Many of the regrets that are shared with me center around what they didn't get to do in life, like never taking that trip to Europe or not pursuing a specific education. I often hear regrets about poor choices in partners, especially if addiction or infidelity was involved. It's not uncommon for patients to express deep sadness if they are estranged from family, which looks a lot like regret. Some patients experience anticipatory grief when they know they will miss out on significant life events, such as the birth of a grandchild. Many regret not taking better care of their health, such as those with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease who regret ever picking up a cigarette. I have a big regret that has been weighing on me. 2 years ago, I was hospitalized for a suicide attempt, and during that difficult time, I made a promise to myself that if I ever made it through, I would go to Italy. It was something I had always wanted to do, and it felt like a tangible goal to work towards. I saved up as much money as I could, but then COVID hit, and my plans were put on hold indefinitely. Now, looking back, if I were to die tomorrow, not fulfilling that promise to myself would be my biggest regret. It's something that I've had on my bucket list since I was just 4 years old, and it feels like such a missed opportunity. As someone who worked in long-term care for 12 years, I had the privilege of witnessing some beautiful moments. One of the most touching moments I recall was a married couple who shared a room. The wife had cancer and kidney failure, and I was assisting her with lunch one day while her husband sat with us. Despite her physical state, her husband looked at her and then turned to me, saying, "Have you ever seen a more beautiful woman?" I was so moved by his words that I had to excuse myself and go to the bathroom to cry. I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said for days. It reminded me of what it feels like to be loved unconditionally. At that time, I had been divorced for many years and thought that I might never find that kind of love again. But then, I met Rod 11 years ago, after being divorced for 23 years. Now, I understand that it's never too late to experience love like that. When I read this response, it reminded me of my own husband. We have been married for 19 years now, and even though I don't always feel beautiful, he always finds a way to tell me I am. Every day, he makes it a point to say I love you and remind me of how much I mean to him. Reading about the husband in the story who still found his wife beautiful, even in her sickness, made me cry because I could see the same love and devotion in my own husband's eyes. It's a reminder that true love transcends physical appearance and can endure even in the face of illness and hardship. As a hospital worker, I've heard my fair share of regrets from dying patients. One that stands out the most was a man who deeply regretted not being a better father to his daughter. He yearned for a chance to reconnect with her, but sadly, his dementia made it impossible for him to recall that they had already reconciled years prior, and she visited him frequently. I desperately wished I could have found a way to help him realize that he had actually fulfilled his final wish, and that his daughter was a part of his life. Unfortunately, he passed away without truly understanding the positive impact he had on his daughter's life and the meaningful connection they shared. My goodness, this has to be the most heart-wrenching story I've come across in the entire thread. When I was 21, I started working as an oncology nurse right after finishing nursing school. I had a patient around my age who was battling lung cancer, and he was nearing the end of his life. Just hours before he passed away, I sat with him as he shared his regrets. He wished he had more time to experience love, get married, and start a family. He was so young, and his regrets were centered around the life he didn't get to live. His parents arrived just before he passed away, and it was a heart-wrenching experience. In contrast, many older patients I encountered had fascinating life stories to share and were generally at peace with the lives they led. However, a common regret among them was working too much and not spending enough time with their loved ones. Sometimes I feel my bones straining under the weight of all the lives I'm not living. Jonathan Safran Foer, extremely loud and incredibly close. I was a newly qualified nurse working independently when we received a call about an incoming trauma patient, a woman in her 50s involved in a multi-car accident. We prepared for her arrival, uncertain about her condition. When she arrived, she was breathing on her own but struggling, with asymmetrical chest expansion. She had multiple deep lacerations, blown pupils, and was covered in debris. Her vital signs were unstable, and we knew she was about to go into cardiac arrest. I stood near her head, ready to assist with her airway and provide comfort. Looking straight into my eyes, she spoke in a hoarse, labored voice. I was angry. I told her I was disappointed in her. Tears filled her eyes, and her vitals dropped further. She whispered, "I'm sorry," just before her heart stopped beating. Despite our efforts to resuscitate her and perform advanced cardiac life support, we ultimately had to declare her time of death. To this day, her face and the emotional pain in her eyes haunt me. Growing up, my mom and I had a rule: no matter how angry or busy we were, we always made sure to say "I love you" before parting ways. This applied to short car rides, phone calls, or even cross-country trips, just in case. I worked as a hospice nurse, and one of my elderly patients had a fast-growing malignant melanoma on the side of his neck. He had spent his entire life working as a farmer and never married. One night, we had a conversation about any life regrets he had. He thought for a moment and said he wished he had worn a hat while farming. I couldn't help but wish the same for him. I love this answer, and I hope he's farming in a better place now, wearing a hat. I'm a paramedic, and I once responded to a call for a woman in her 30s experiencing shortness of breath. She and her boyfriend had recently moved into an apartment together and were arguing over something trivial like which room to unpack first. He thought she was just being overly dramatic. We transported her to the hospital, but she didn't make it. In just a few seconds, she went from being conscious and talking to unresponsive and asystolic. The couple was so consumed by their argument that they never had a chance to say goodbye or express their love for each other. She didn't have any last words, which somehow made the situation even worse. What caused her death? We believe it was a pulmonary embolism, one of the few conditions that can cause such rapid decline. There isn't much that can be done for them, especially outside of a hospital setting. Nearly a decade ago, I worked in the respiratory ward of a hospital. Back then, I was young and would occasionally take a puff of a cigarette when out with friends. One day, a dying patient of mine held my hand as she struggled to breathe. She urged me never to smoke, as it was the reason she was now facing death. She despised smoking for the damage it had caused and described the feeling of being choked to death as utterly terrifying. We did our best to keep her comfortable during her final days, and she passed away not long after. I never forgot her advice and never took another puff. I've cared for many COVID-19 patients and witnessed many deaths. One patient, a mentally sharp woman living in an adult family home, contracted the virus during an outbreak at her residence. She spent weeks in the hospital before being placed on end-of-life care. She was heavily sedated and connected to a patient-controlled analgesia pump to ease her transition. One night, I heard her IV alarm go off, indicating an occlusion. In my experience, this alarm often sounds when a patient dies, as blood flow stops. I braced myself for the worst. However, when I entered her room, she was still alive. I restarted the pump and took a moment to reflect on the fact that she had been completely alone throughout her entire hospital stay. I decided to clean her face with a warm washcloth, and as soon as it touched her skin, she whimpered, leaned into me, and sighed deeply. Opening one eye, she softly thanked me, mistaking me for her daughter. She expressed regret for not spending more time with her loved ones. A few days later, she passed away, and that was the first time I cried since the pandemic began. Thank you for what you do. You are a good person. I once cared for a 40-year-old patient who was dying from breast cancer that had spread throughout her body. She had been diagnosed with breast cancer 10 years earlier and had undergone a mastectomy. Her doctor had recommended a bilateral mastectomy with reconstruction due to her high risk of recurrence, but she chose to keep her remaining breast, hoping to feel more complete if she remarried. She regretted not undergoing the bilateral mastectomy, as it might have prevented the cancer's return and her premature death. She never did remarry. A week later, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. Immediately, I told my doctor I wanted a bilateral mastectomy with reconstruction, as I remembered my patient's regret. My doctor initially pushed for a lumpectomy, but hearing my patient's story likely saved my life by influencing my decision. Thanks for sharing your story. I recently found out I have the BRCA1 breast cancer gene, which comes with an approximately 86% chance of developing breast cancer before I turn 80. I still need to meet with a genetic counselor, I know that a double mastectomy is a common preventative measure. My mom had it done after being diagnosed with cancer. Your post helps me be more open to the idea. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to Answerly Stories for more interesting real-life stories and experiences.